Hi there, and welcome to this vodcast looking at the Hungarian Uprising of 1956. This vodcast, we're just going to focus on the causes and the key features of the uprising. I'm going to do a separate one with regards to consequences, because for paper 2, consequences is basically 2/3 of your paper. So you can have a pause and have a look at the lesson objectives, but I'd rather we just move on. So now we're going to have a look at the long-term causes, and as you can see, I've shaded them. Green is anything to do with Hungary. Anything that's in this peach colour, well, that's looking at external factors. And the first one was that Stalin dies in 1953. And when Stalin dies, after a period of time, a new leader called Nikita Khrushchev is brought in. And in 1956, he gives a secret speech to key party officials in the Soviet Union. And he denounces Stalin's policies, especially those with regards to the control of people, the kind of lack of political freedom, etc. And he begins to free political prisoners. He opens up some of the prisons. And some people have argued that he wanted to reform. He wanted to make himself a kind of be his own person rather than in Stalin's shadow. But others have suggested that what he was actually doing was he was wanting to know which Eastern European countries would, because of this speech, want reforms themselves, because they were the ones who were a threat to him. Now, one key event that could be explained why there was a Hungarian uprising was what happened in Poland. About this time, there were protests in Poland who were wanting reforms. Now, some reforms did occur, but the key fact there was they didn't want to leave the Warsaw Pact. They didn't want to leave the Soviet sphere of influence. Now, in Hungary, it was being run by a guy called Rákosi, and he was known as Stalin's best pupil. He crushed any opposition. He had a secret police called the RVH or the RVO, depending upon the kind of definition translation of it. But they were very much like the KGB. They crushed any political opposition. He was known to salami slice the opposition, not literally, but kind of getting rid of each group in turn. And he modelled himself on Stalin. Now, Hungary's economy was very, very weak. At the end of the war, it had land taken from it, and a lot of its resources went to the Soviet Union. And this made the quality of life in Hungary, very, very poor, and it was getting worse. So during this time of de-Stalinization, people began to look at people like Rákosi and think they're old news and they wanted change. Now, I've got a worksheet here. I'll put a link on. I'll put it onto a OneDrive so you can have a go at it yourself if you want for revision purposes. But key overview, if you want to pause it and have a go now, you can do. But the key overview is on the next slide. So if we have a look at the timeline, in July 1956, Rákosi's forced out. Basically, he gets told by another Eastern European politician that he's ill, which is communist for you're sacked. And this is due to his unpopularity and the fact that there's a move towards move away from Stalinism and a move towards some degree of reform. Now, this, coupled with those other factors that we looked at previously, especially the poor quality of life, the worsening economic situation, meant that there were protests in Budapest against the communists, and these began to turn into riots. And Khrushchev, spotting the threat this was, decided to bring in a guy called Nagy. Now, he was a reformer. He was known to be a reformer, but Khrushchev allowed Nagy to become the new Hungarian leader because he thought it would stop the protests. Now, just a few days afterwards, Nagy starts to reform Hungary, and he starts to bring in more freedoms. He's looking towards speech and freedom of speech and freedom in elections. Khrushchev is thinking, you're going to have freedom of elections, but communists will still win. But then a few days after that, Nagy crosses a line massively because he wants further reforms, and he wants Hungary to leave the Warsaw Pact and to become a neutral nation, not siding with the West, but not siding with the Soviet Union. And that for Khrushchev is a line too far. He's overstepped the mark. And 2 days after that, Khrushchev had sent in the Soviet army to stop Hungary leaving the Warsaw Pact. He'd already kind of brought forces in to Hungary as this was kind of going on. So some people have suggested that, much like what we said earlier about the secret speech, he was wanting to see if Naj would react against it. So why did Khrushchev react the way he did? Well, Khrushchev's acting out of concern. If Hungary is allowed to break away from the Warsaw Pact and as such from the Soviet sphere of influence, then it's possible other communist nations would also try to do this. And you've got to remember that Eastern European nations under communist control were acting as a buffer to protect the Soviet Union from the belief that it had that America would try to end communism in the Soviet Union through force. So the idea of Hungary breaking away is weakening that buffer zone. It's weakening that control that it would have. And from that, it's quite possible that other Eastern European nations would try to do that. So what was the Soviet response? Well, Khrushchev, on the 4th of November 1956 onwards, he sent in over 1,000 tanks and many thousands and thousands of soldiers. The Hungarians fought against the Soviet army, but it was almost impossible for it to have won. It didn't have the weaponry. Molotov cocktails or petrol bombs are no good against tanks. It's almost impossible to destroy those tanks with the weapons they had. And it's assumed that roughly about 20,000 Hungarians were killed in the fighting. Many Hungarians flee to Austria, and Naj himself, he escaped into the Yugoslavian embassy. Now, when he was there, he was told by the Soviet Union once the uprising had been crushed that he would be safe if he left, that no harm would come to him. He did leave. He was arrested by Soviet agents and executed. And a new pro-Soviet leader was installed in Hungary to kind of reaffirm Hungary's kind of status as a satellite state of the Soviet Union. Khrushchev actually said his execution was a warning to all the other socialist leaders. So we've gone through the causes, we've gone through the key features. I hope this has been useful. If you have any queries, please feel free to post a comment, and thanks for listening.